It all started with a rusty old shovel, not some fancy archaeological tool, but the kind my grandpa, a man who loved digging more than he loved sitting still, used to turn over the soil in his garden. One summer afternoon when the sun was a big lazy eye in the sky, he called me over. "Look at this," he said, holding up a chipped piece of something that looked like a very old, very smooth stone. To me, it was just another rock. To him, it was a mystery. He had this way of looking at things like everything had a story it was just waiting to tell. He'd find a smooth pebble and tell me how it was once part of a mighty mountain, tumbled, and worn by 1,000 rivers. This time, though, it was different. He didn't have a story. He had a question. "What if this isn't just a rock, Leo?" he'd ask. "What if this is a piece of something that saw the world when it was new?" That was the seed. The question that got stuck in my head like a burr on a wool sweater. What if? Grandpa, bless his heart, wasn't a scientist, but he had a scientist's heart. He'd spend hours in the local library poring over dusty books, his finger tracing lines. Of text he probably only half understood. He'd come back and tell me about things like strata and radiocarbon dating, words that sounded like they belonged in a science fiction movie. He was looking for something that would tell him more about his rock. The rock, he was convinced, was a key. It was a fragment of a larger puzzle, a single word in a story that was millions of years old. He even drew a little map of where he'd found it, a spot right under the big oak tree at the edge of his yard. "The ground here," he'd tell me, "is a book. Every layer is a page, and every page is a year, or 100 years, or 1,000,000. He'd get this look in his eyes, a kind of dreamy, far-off look, and I'd know he wasn't really in the garden anymore. He was back in time, in a world I could only imagine. This obsession, this quiet, determined quest of his, got me hooked. I started going with him to the library. At first, it was just to be with him, to watch him get excited about some blurry black-and-white picture of a dinosaur bone. But then I started looking at the pictures myself. I saw these strange, ancient faces, reconstructions of creatures that were halfway between monkeys and people. They had names like Australopithecus and Homo habilis, names that were as hard to pronounce as they were fascinating to look at. I'd imagine them walking through forests, swinging from branches, their eyes wide with the wonder of a world that was wild and untamed. These were our ancestors, the people who came before us, and they lived in a world without cars or phones or even books, a world that was pure and raw. One day, he came running into the kitchen, his face a mix of excitement and disbelief. He was holding a book open to a page with a picture of a jawbone, not a complete one, but a fragment, with teeth that looked, well, they looked kind of human, but bigger, rougher. The caption under the picture was what really got him. It said, "Ouranopithecus, Macedoniensis." "Leo," he said, his voice a little shaky, "I think this is it. I think this is what we've been looking for." He showed me the book, pointing to a section that talked about the discovery of these fossils in Greece. The book described the creature as a hominoid, a kind of proto-human, living about 9 to 10 million years ago. My grandpa, with his simple garden shovel, had unearthed a tiny, insignificant fragment of a similar story. He was sure of it. He believed that the rock he found in his garden, a piece of what he now called Leo's rock, was a piece of the same grand, ancient puzzle. He started a new project. He called it Operation Ouranopithecus. He had a binder now with all his notes and printouts from the library. He even had a magnifying glass, which he'd used to stare at the rock he'd found, turning it over and over in his hand. He'd talk to the rock, whispering to it as if it could hear him. "Tell me your story," he'd say. "Tell me what you saw." He was a man with a child's heart, full of wonder and curiosity. He didn't care that he was just a gardener. He cared about the story. The story of a creature that walked the earth millions of years before us, a creature that was part of our family tree, a forgotten branch. This was more than just a hobby for him. It was a mission, a quest. He believed that even a small discovery could change the way we see the world. He believed that his little rock, found in a garden in a small town, was connected to a larger narrative that spanned continents and millions of years. He saw the world as a place full of hidden connections, a grand tapestry woven with threads of time. And he was just a little boy with a magnifying glass, trying to see the individual threads. He wanted me to see it too. He wanted me to understand that the past isn't just something you read about in a book. It's all around us, buried just beneath our feet, waiting to be discovered. He'd talk about the time period, the late Miocene, a time when the world was different. He'd tell me about the forests, the open woodlands, and the animals that roamed them. He'd describe the climate, the way the world was slowly changing, setting the stage for the next act of the great play of life. He'd tell me that Ouranopithecus wasn't alone. It lived alongside other apes, other creatures, all of them trying to survive, to find food, to raise their young. He'd make up little stories about them, about a mother Ouranopithecus, searching for berries, a father protecting his family from a predator. These stories, his stories, were more real to me than any textbook. They brought the past to life. They made Ouranopithecus not just a name on a page, but a living, breathing being, a part of our story. This was the beginning of my journey into the past. It wasn't a journey I planned. It was a journey I was led on by a man with a rusty shovel and a heart full of wonder. He taught me to look at the world differently, to see the history in a simple stone, to hear the echoes of the past in the quiet rustling of leaves. He taught me that the biggest stories aren't always found in big, important places. Sometimes they're found right in your own backyard, waiting for you to dig them up. My grandpa, a simple gardener, was the first archaeologist I ever knew. He was the one who showed me that the past isn't just a collection of dates and facts. It's a living, breathing thing, a story that is always being told, always being rewritten. And we, the living, are just a small part of that grand, unending narrative. He showed me that we are all, in a way, archaeologists of our own lives, digging for the stories that make us who we are. And that little rock? I still have it. It sits on my desk, a smooth, chipped piece of something that might be nothing, and might be everything. To me, it's not just a rock, it's a key. A reminder of a man who taught me to look for the stories hidden in plain sight, to see the wonder in the mundane, and to never stop asking, what if? It's a testament to his belief that a simple discovery, a small fragment of the past, can open up a whole new world. A world where our ancestors, forgotten for millions of years, are waiting to be remembered. A world where a boy with a rusty shovel can be a hero, a pioneer, an explorer of time. Grandpa's enthusiasm wasn't something you could ignore. It was like a fire, a quiet, steady burn that lit up everything around it. His binder, Operation Ouranopithecus, grew thicker every week. He'd come back from the library with photocopies of diagrams of skulls and mandibles, articles with long, complicated names, and even a few books he'd managed to borrow through interlibrary loan. He had a big map of the world pinned to his wall, and he'd use a little red thumbtack to mark the location of Ouranopithecus fossil sites in Greece. He'd stand there, hands on his hips, staring at the map as if he could see the ancient forests and plains where these creatures once roamed. "See, Leo," he'd say, "it's all connected. This spot in Greece and our garden right here. They're part of the same story." I started to get really into it, too. I'd sit with him at the kitchen table, a huge pile of books between us, and we'd try to decipher the technical language. Words like hominoid, Miocene epoch, and dental morphology became part of our daily vocabulary. We learned that Ouranopithecus was a genus of prehistoric hominoid, a group that includes modern humans and all our close ancestors. The name itself, Ouranopithecus, meant Ouranos' ape, after the Greek sky god. It was a poetic name for a creature that was a key to understanding our own origins. We read about the key fossils, like the one found in the late 1970s in the village of Ravin de la Pluie, which included a nearly complete face and jaw. This wasn't just a tooth or a fragment. This was a face that looked a little like ours, but also a little different. It was a face that could have looked at the same moon, felt the same sun, as we do today, but millions of years ago. The discovery of Ouranopithecus was a big deal in the world of paleoanthropology. Before its discovery, the story of human evolution was a bit like a book with a missing chapter. Scientists knew about the early hominids in Africa, like Australopithecus, and they knew about the later hominids like Homo erectus and Homo sapiens. But there was a big gap, a period of millions of years, that was a little fuzzy. Ouranopithecus, with its specific physical features, helped to fill in that gap. We learned about its robust mandible, its large teeth with thick enamel, and its distinctive facial features which were more human-like than a typical ape. These weren't just random details to us anymore. They were clues to a puzzle that was millions of years old. Grandpa had this theory, this wild, wonderful theory, that the rock he found wasn't just a rock. It was a piece of fossilized bone, a fragment of Ouranopithecus that had somehow, impossibly made its way to his garden. He knew it was a long shot. The chances were practically zero. But he believed, and his belief was contagious. He'd get his magnifying glass out, and we'd examine the rock together. We'd look for striations, for a texture that wasn't quite stone, but something else. We'd talk about continental drift, about how the world's land masses had moved over millions of years. He'd even talk about the possibility of an ancient river carrying a fossil from one continent to another. It was all a bit far-fetched, but it was also a brilliant way to learn about geology, about history, about the way the world works. He started writing letters, not emails, but old-fashioned letters with his shaky handwriting addressed to professors and museums all over the world. He'd introduce himself. "My name is Walter, and I'm a gardener with a question." He'd explain his discovery, his theory, and he'd even include a little sketch of the rock he'd found. I'd watch him seal the envelopes, a look of serious determination on his face. He wasn't expecting a reply, not really. He was just putting his message out into the world, hoping someone, somewhere would hear him. Most of the letters went unanswered, but a very few, came back with a polite but firm explanation of why his theory was unlikely. They'd explain that fossils of this age and type were almost exclusively found in certain geological formations, and that it was improbable that one would be found in his garden. They were nice about it, but they were also clear. But Grandpa wasn't discouraged. He'd just nod, read the letter, and then add it to his binder. "They're just playing the odds, Leo," he'd say, "but sometimes the odds are wrong." He was a man who believed in the improbable. He believed in the magic of a single, small discovery changing everything. He believed in the power of a question that could lead you down a path you never expected to take. And his question, what if, had led us to Ouranopithecus, to a creature that was a bridge between the apes and us. We learned about the debate surrounding Ouranopithecus. Was it a direct ancestor of humans? Or was it a side branch, an evolutionary dead end? The scientific community was divided. Some scientists argued that its facial features and dental structure were so similar to later hominids that it had to be a direct ancestor. Others argued that the similarities were due to convergent evolution, where two unrelated species develop similar traits because they live in similar environments. This debate was fascinating to me. It wasn't a simple yes or no answer. It was a puzzle, a mystery that scientists were still trying to solve. And Grandpa and I, with our binder and our rusty shovel, felt like we were a small part of that puzzle, too. We were on the team, even if we were just the bench warmers. He'd talk about the environment of the late Miocene. The world was changing. The climate was cooling, and the lush forests of the past were giving way to more open woodlands and grasslands. Ouranopithecus had to adapt. Its large, thick enameled teeth were perfect for chewing tough, fibrous plants, something you'd find in a more open environment. This wasn't just a random fact. It was a piece of the story of a creature adapting, surviving, and slowly, over millions of years, evolving into something new. The story of our own resilience, our own adaptability. My grandpa wasn't just teaching me about some ancient ape. He was teaching me about life. He was teaching me about the importance of curiosity, of questioning what you're told, of believing in the impossible. He was teaching me that every single one of us is a part of a much larger story, a story that stretches back millions of years. And that story isn't just about big heroes and epic battles. It's about a small creature living in a forest, trying to find food for its young. It's about a simple gardener with a rusty shovel and a heart full of wonder. He never found a definitive answer to his question. The rock remained a mystery, but that didn't matter. The journey, the quest, was the point. The stories we told, the books we read, the letters we wrote, that was the real treasure. He gave me a gift more valuable than any fossil. He gave me the gift of curiosity. He taught me to see the world not as a collection of facts, but as a collection of stories, all waiting to be heard. And the story of Ouranopithecus, our ancient ancestor, was the first great story he ever told me. And it was a story that changed my life forever. It was a story about the past, but it was also a story about the future, about the endless possibilities that lie just beneath the surface, waiting for us to dig them up. The letters from the experts, polite but dismissive, didn't dampen Grandpa's spirits one bit. In fact, they seemed to fuel him. He'd read them aloud, a mischievous glint in his eye, and then he'd add them to his ever-expanding binder, Operation Ouranopithecus. "See, Leo," he'd say, tapping the page with his finger, "they're telling me what they know, but they're not telling me what they don't know." He saw the gaps in their knowledge as opportunities, not dead ends. He saw the polite rejections not as failures, but as a challenge. He was convinced that the academic world, with its strict rules and procedures, was missing the point. The point, he believed, wasn't about following a pre-written script. The point was about the unexpected, the improbable, the sudden and beautiful discovery that could upend everything. His focus shifted from the single rock he'd found to the larger geological context. We started looking at maps of the region, not just modern maps, but geological ones. He'd get them from the local university's geology department, talking his way into the office with a charming smile and a story about a school project he was helping his grandson with. He'd bring these huge, unwieldy maps home, spreading them out on the floor of the living room, and we'd crawl around on our hands and knees, our fingers tracing the lines of ancient fault lines and rock formations. He wanted to understand the book of the ground in our own backyard. He wanted to see if there was any chance, any tiny, minuscule chance, that the soil we were standing on had a connection to the soil where Ouranopithecus fossils had been found. This was a different kind of detective work. It wasn't about looking for a specific clue. It was about understanding the entire crime scene. We learned about the Pliocene and Pleistocene epochs, the periods that came after the Miocene. We learned about glacial periods, about the slow, grinding movement of ice sheets that carved out valleys and carried debris from one place to another. We learned about the movement of tectonic plates, the slow, unstoppable force that had reshaped the continents over millions of years. Grandpa's mind was like a sponge, soaking up every piece of information, every fact, every detail. He wasn't just learning. He was building a new story, a new narrative, a new possibility. We started a new project, a sub-project of Operation Ouranopithecus. We called it the Great Backyard Dig. We weren't just going to dig in one spot. We were going to create a grid, a series of small, shallow trenches, and we were going to meticulously document every layer of soil. We had a small notebook, a ruler, and a camera, and we'd spend hours in the backyard, carefully scraping away the soil, one layer at a time. We'd find all sorts of things: old coins, pieces of pottery, a rusted-out toy car. Each discovery was a little victory, a small piece of the story of our own backyard. But we were always looking for something more. We were looking for the impossible. We were looking for a piece of the Miocene. This wasn't just a physical dig. It was a mental one. 2. Grandpa would talk to me about the nature of evidence, about the difference between a hypothesis and a theory. He'd explain that a scientist needs to be both a believer and a skeptic. You need to believe in the possibility of your idea, but you also need to be skeptical enough to test it, to try to prove yourself wrong. He was teaching me the scientific method, not from a textbook, but from the ground up. He'd say, "Leo, we have a hypothesis. A piece of Ouranopithecus is in our garden. Now we need to find evidence to support it. Or we need to find evidence that proves it wrong. Either way, we'll learn something." He even reached out to a local university professor, a quiet, unassuming man named Dr. Harris, who taught geology. Dr. Harris, surprisingly, agreed to meet with us. He came to the house, one afternoon a little confused but intrigued. We showed him the rock, the binder, the maps, and the grid we'd dug in the backyard. Dr. Harris listened patiently, his eyes moving from Grandpa's enthusiastic face to the small, chipped stone. He didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss us. He just listened. When we were done, he picked up the rock, turned it over in his hand, and said, "It's a very interesting piece of chert, Mr. Walter. Very interesting indeed." Chert, he explained, was a type of sedimentary rock, a kind of hardened mud or clay. He explained that it was a very common type of rock, and that the striations we thought were signs of fossilized bone were probably just natural formations in the stone. The news hit me hard. It wasn't Ouranopithecus. It was just a rock. But Grandpa, ever the optimist, just smiled. "Thank you, Dr. Harris," he said. "Thank you for looking at it. Thank you for telling us what it is." Dr. Harris, a little surprised by Grandpa's reaction, asked why he wasn't disappointed. "Disappointed?" Grandpa said, a twinkle in his eye. "Why would I be disappointed? We learned something. We learned what it is, and we learned what it's not. That's a victory, son. That's a huge victory." He saw the end of one chapter as the beginning of another. He saw the no as a step closer to yes. Dr. Harris, impressed by Grandpa's attitude, started coming by once a week. He'd bring books from his own collection, and he'd talk to us about geology, about the history of our region, about the way the earth tells its own story. He was a scientist, a man of facts and evidence, but he was also a teacher, a man who saw the value of a good question, no matter how improbable. He even helped us identify some of the other things we'd found in our dig: a piece of a colonial-era pipe, a shard of ceramic from a local pottery factory that had long since closed. Our backyard wasn't a place for ancient apes, but it was a place with a history, a story that was just as fascinating. Grandpa's focus shifted again. He was still obsessed with Ouranopithecus, but now he saw the connection between the grand global story of human evolution and the small local story of our own town. He saw that the same principles applied, the same careful observation, the same patient documentation, the same belief in the power of a single detail. He taught me that the past isn't just one thing. It's a million things, all interconnected, all part of a larger whole. And our job, our quest, wasn't to find one specific thing. It was to find the connections. It was to see the web, not just the single thread. The great backyard dig eventually came to an end. We never found Ouranopithecus. We never found anything that was millions of years old, but we found something just as valuable. We found a story. The story of our own backyard, our own town, our own family. We found a connection to the people who had lived on this very spot before us. And we found a deeper connection to each other, a shared passion for discovery, a shared belief in the power of a question. The rusty old shovel was just a tool. The real digging was happening inside our heads, inside our hearts. And that, I'm pretty sure, is the most important kind of digging there is. Grandpa's obsession with Ouranopithecus didn't just end with the realization that his rock was just a rock. If anything, it deepened. He saw the experience not as a failure, but as a lesson. He had learned the scientific method, the importance of evidence, and the value of a good mentor like Dr. Harris. The backyard dig had shown him that even without a grand million-year-old fossil, a story could be found. The story of our town, the people who had lived there before us, and the small pieces of their lives they had left behind. But his heart still belonged to the big picture, to the story of humanity's origins. He still wanted to find his piece of Ouranopithecus. His focus shifted from the backyard to the library again, but this time with a new sense of purpose. He wasn't just looking for pictures of fossils anymore. He was looking for a narrative. He was looking for the story of how and why Ouranopithecus was so important. He and I would spend hours in the dusty stacks, poring over books on human evolution, paleoanthropology, and historical geology. We learned about the African origins hypothesis, the widely accepted theory that modern humans evolved in Africa. But we also learned about the debates, the dissenting voices, the questions that remained unanswered. This was where Ouranopithecus came in. Its existence in Europe, millions of years before the first known hominids in Africa, was a fascinating wrinkle in the story. The idea was that Ouranopithecus, with its distinctly human-like features, might represent a lineage that moved out of Europe and back into Africa, where it eventually gave rise to the hominid line that led to us. It was a bold idea, and it was fiercely debated. We learned about the different theories of human migration, the out-of-Africa theory, the multi-regional hypothesis, and the less-known but still discussed Eurasian origin theory. Grandpa was like a detective, sifting through the evidence, weighing the pros and cons of each argument. He wasn't just accepting what he read, he was questioning it. He was thinking for himself. He'd get his notepad out and draw timelines. He'd draw a line that stretched across the page, and at one end, he'd write 10 million years ago. At the other, he'd write today. In between, he'd mark the key moments, the appearance of Ouranopithecus in Greece, the earliest hominids. In Africa, the migration of Homo erectus out of Africa, the rise of Neanderthals, and finally the emergence of Homo sapiens. He'd draw little arrows, showing the different proposed migration routes. It was a visual representation of the story, and it made the abstract concepts of millions of years of time feel more concrete, more real. He was particularly fascinated by the idea of an ancient land bridge, a time when continents were connected in a way they are not today. He'd talk about how a creature like Ouranopithecus could have moved from what is now Greece into Africa. He'd talk about the changing climate, the slow march of the ice ages, the shifting coastlines. He saw the world not as a static map, but as a dynamic, living thing, constantly in motion, constantly changing. He saw the land as a character in the story, a character that was just as important as the creatures that walked on it. He started a new project, not a dig, but a kind of thought experiment. He called it the Ouranopithecus journey. He would imagine what it would be like to be an Ouranopithecus. What would you eat? What would you fear? What would the world look like? He'd close his eyes and describe a world that was lush with vegetation, with different kinds of animals roaming the land, and a sky that was wider and deeper than the one we see today. He was not just studying the facts, he was trying to get inside the head of our ancestor. He was trying to understand what it meant to be a hominoid, millions of years before we were us. He'd talk about the social structure of Ouranopithecus. We learned that their teeth, with their large canines, suggested a degree of sexual dimorphism. which is when males and females of the same species have different physical characteristics. This, he explained, could mean that they lived in groups with a social hierarchy, similar to modern gorillas. This was a detail that brought the creature to life for me. It wasn't just a fossil, it was a community, a family, a tribe. They had relationships, they had fears, they had hopes, they had a life. He also started talking about the missing link and how the term was a bit misleading. He explained that evolution wasn't a single chain, but a sprawling, bushy tree. Ouranopithecus, he argued, wasn't a missing link. It was a branch, a beautiful, important branch of our family tree that had been forgotten for millions of years. He wanted to make sure that we never forgot it again. He wanted to make sure that its story was told, not just in academic journals, but to everyone, to anyone who would listen. His mission was no longer about finding a fossil in his backyard. It was about telling a story, the story of Ouranopithecus, the story of human evolution, the story of our family tree. He started writing it all down, not as a scientific paper, but as a series of short, accessible stories. He'd read them to me in the evenings, his voice filled with the same wonder and excitement he'd had when he first showed me the rock. He wasn't just telling me about the past, he was building a bridge to it, a bridge made of words and imagination. This was the final stage of Grandpa's quest. He had moved beyond the physical act of digging and into the intellectual and creative act of storytelling. He realized that the most important part of any discovery isn't the thing you find, but the story you tell about it. He had found a story, a grand, epic story, and he was determined to share it. He was a gardener who had become a storyteller, a man who had gone from digging in the dirt to exploring the deep and winding channels of human history. And I, his grandson, was his first and most attentive audience. I was learning that the greatest adventures aren't always about going to far-off places. Sometimes the greatest adventures are about going back in time, about exploring the past that is hidden just beneath the surface of our world and our own lives. The stories Grandpa wrote weren't just for me anymore. He started reading them to anyone who would listen. He'd bring his notepad and his magnifying glass to the local coffee shop and tell the story of Ouranopithecus to the other regulars, a group of retirees who usually only talked about the weather and their grandchildren. At first, they were a little puzzled. They'd sip their coffee and nod politely, not quite sure what to make of this old man talking about a 9-million-year-old ape. But Grandpa had a way of making the story come alive. He'd talk about the forests, the changing climate, and the struggle for survival in a way that was both historically accurate and deeply human. He made them care. He made them see that this ancient creature, this forgotten branch of our family tree, was just as much a part of their story as it was a part of mine. He wasn't just telling them a story. He was inviting them into a world. He described the feel of the cool morning air in a Miocene forest, the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves, the sound of the wind rustling through the canopy. He'd paint a picture with his words, and they'd lean in, their faces a mix of fascination and wonder. He'd even bring in his photocopies from the library, the blurry pictures of jawbones and teeth, and he'd point to them with a shaky finger, explaining the significance of each detail. He was a self-taught expert, a man who had built his knowledge from scratch, and his passion was infectious. One of the regulars, an old woman named Eleanor, who used to be a history teacher, got particularly interested. She started bringing in her own books, and they'd have these long animated debates about the Eurasian origin hypothesis versus the out-of-Africa theory. They weren't fighting, they were exploring. They were two people, from different walks of life, brought together by a shared curiosity about the past. They'd argue about the dating of fossils, the interpretation of dental morphology, and the implications of a European ancestor for the story of human evolution. It was beautiful to watch. It was a testament to the power of a single, good question, to bring people together. Grandpa's storytelling wasn't just about facts and figures anymore. It was about philosophy. He'd talk about the nature of time, about how millions of years, an amount of time we can't even comprehend, is just a blink in the eye of the universe. He'd talk about how we, modern humans, with our smartphones and our fast cars, are just a tiny, insignificant part of a much larger story. He'd talk about the humbling power of a single fossil, a single piece of evidence that can tell us so much about who we are and where we came from. He was teaching me, and everyone else who would listen, that the past is not just something to be studied. It is something to be felt, to be experienced, to be a part of. He even started a small Ouranopithecus club at the coffee shop. It was just a few people sitting around a table, drinking coffee and talking about the distant past. They'd bring in articles they'd found, documentaries they'd watched, and they'd share their thoughts and theories. It was a community built on curiosity, a group of people who had been touched by Grandpa's passion and had decided to join him on his journey. They were all, in their own way, archaeologists. They were all digging for the story. One day, he got an email. Not a polite rejection, but a real, genuine inquiry from a graduate student at a university in the UK. The student, named Sarah, was working on her thesis on the Eurasian origin theory, and she had stumbled upon a blog post that Eleanor, the old history teacher, had written about Grandpa's club. Sarah had been intrigued by the story of a group of retirees in a small town debating the finer points of paleoanthropology. She wanted to know more. She wanted to hear Grandpa's stories. This was a huge deal. It was a validation of everything Grandpa had been doing. It was proof that his simple, passionate quest had reached beyond our small town, beyond the coffee shop, and into the world of academia. He was finally being heard, not as a crazy old man with a rock, but as a passionate enthusiast, a self-taught expert, a storyteller who had brought a forgotten part of our history to life. He wrote back to Sarah, and they started a correspondence. He'd send her his stories, his timelines, his drawings. She'd send him links to academic papers, pictures of fossils, and her own thoughts on the subject. They had this beautiful symbiotic relationship. He gave her the passion, the storytelling, the human element. She gave him the facts, the evidence, the academic rigor. They were a perfect team. He, the gardener, and she, the graduate student, were working together to tell the story of Ouranopithecus. Grandpa's quest had come full circle. It had started with a rusty shovel and a rock in his backyard, and it had ended with a collaboration, with a scientist halfway across the world. He hadn't found a fossil. He hadn't changed the world of paleoanthropology, but he had changed something just as important. He had changed the lives of the people around him. He had shown them that curiosity is a powerful force, that the past is not a foreign country, but a part of our own story, and that a single, simple question can lead to the most amazing and unexpected of journeys. And he had shown me, his grandson, that the most important thing you can ever do is to never stop digging, to never stop looking for the stories that are waiting to be told.